And it gets so much crazier than just what we've gone over. Like, we don't have enough time in this podcast to go over all the stuff, which is why there's going to be a lot in the resources section.
I don't have the brain capacity to go into all this in this podcast episode.
It excites me so much.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. I am your host, Circa. With me, as always, is my co-host, Corrin.
Yo, yo, yo. What's up? What's up?
What's good with it?
I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm just in a good mood today, I guess. I'm like dancing in my chair a little.
Yeah, me too. We finally got some carpets in here at Orlando HQ to cut down on the bounce in here.
Yeah.
So yeah, things are finally coming together. The room's starting to look put together behind me in the video. I know that you guys have your own challenges with Nashville, but we're coming to the finish line over here.
Yeah. Yeah, we still have, I was telling the indies on live yesterday, I was like, it looks okay right here. It's not very decorated, but it looks good. And then beyond the camera, it's just things are everywhere. So we're still getting it figured out. We have all our books on our bookshelf. So that's kind of an easy part.
That's exciting.
But hey, they're not on the floor. So it's great. Win.
Right. That's the best. Yeah. Well, yeah. So today we have another nerdy kind of episode, but I think it's going to be really cool because, we had another nerdy episode recently where we talked about like death of websites,
right?
Which is a very nerdy topic. This topic is equally nerdy and difficult to understand, but it has the added benefit of being something that musicians talk about all the time.
Right.
Like, just like marketers were talking about, like, how does Google search ranking algorithm work? I've got the hack. Like, that's what's going on with Spotify right now for musicians. Everyone's positing how the recommendation engine works. Everyone's heard this tidbit or that from a Spotify business side representative. And it seems that there's no one who's actually like, no, this is nuts and bolts how it actually works.
Right.
And the only people who are really suited to do that are the people who developed the recommendation engine at Spotify. So what we did is just did a deep dive on conference presentations from Spotify's development team. So I went to LinkedIn. I found a little thread that I could pull, like a trail of breadcrumbs, by finding the first engineer that was representative for the machine learning side of Spotify's development team. And then I found their coworkers. I found relevant titles at Spotify for people who are in that section of the business, building the recommendation engine. And then I just cross-referenced all of their names and titles with YouTube, with Facebook video, with Vimeo, and found all these presentations that they've given to other propeller heads like themselves about their work at Spotify. And so all the information was contained there. Everything we're about to talk about in this episode is just literally just pouring over those developer conferences and listening to what the developers actually have to say about what they built.
Yeah. That's really cool too, because I mean, I think there's a lot of speculation, and the people who are saying different things about how Spotify works are probably taking information from their experience, right? Like, I don't think anybody's like making anything up, but I do think that they're potentially, like just taking what they've experienced and kind of interpreting that data, which is probably very, 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 very limited compared to the actual data that's out there, and how things work. So obviously, like, if there are people who have built this, there's no one who knows it better than them. And so I'm excited. Right. I mean, I'm going to be learning along with the rest of you guys quite a bit because Cirque definitely dove deeper into this than I ever have. So I'm excited to hear all the things.
Hell yeah. So first, before we talk about this, it's important to sort of learn how machine learning works a little bit. Machine learning works by a process of training a machine learning algorithm on a data set. So basically you give the machine learning algorithm this data set, like, for instance, like all the YouTube videos that are on YouTube and how many times they've been watched by which users. That might be a gigantic data set.
Right.
And you set the machine learning algorithm loose on that data and you tell it basically by manner of programming you tell it to find videos that certain users would like based on this data set, right? That they haven't actually watched yet. And so you can train it on this and get like positive hits and then test it and see, is the machine learning algo right? So you can give the machine learning algo positive and negative feedback, and it will just course correct itself. And this type of computing is called neural networks. And basically, like they work with a solution. They train on a solution to find the problem, sort of, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy too, because if you think about, Spotify watching you, right, in a not creepy way, but like the way that you engage with various songs, not just like how many streams you get. Like, I feel like when I hear people talking about various pieces of this, they're like, yeah, how many streams something is getting, or how many saves something is getting, or how many adds to a playlist something is getting. And so those are the hacks that are out there. And in reality, it's like looking at consumption and behavior, right? And like things that are so much more complicated than than simply the number. Like, not that those numbers are relevant, but they're just a very, very top layer of things that are being evaluated by this machine learning,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's just like a 30,000 foot view of machine learning. There's so much to talk about neural networks. Like I'm going to put in the resources here some great YouTube series to follow. Like, I'm not a mathematician. The rest of my family is, but I never got into it. And I can't do the math on this, but I've watched this YouTube series where complex mathematicians basically break down how neural networks work. And it's really frigging interesting. It's sort of like, there's a YouTube series where they start off with like, this is how 2 dimensions works.
Right.
And this is how 3D works. Now 4D and 5D. And they take you into like the 11th dimension piece by piece.
Oh my gosh.
So you could know nothing about like complex extra dimensional math, but you kind of get there conceptually because they walk you through it. And they do the same thing with neural networks. So I'll put it in the show notes. But basically, let's bring it down to the ground level.
Right.
Here's an example of machine learning. How, what I just described, where you give the machine a problem to train on and then set it loose in real life. So they wanted to, the way that they trained the Discover Weekly recommendation engine, the model they use to populate your Discover Weekly, I'm not 100% sure that this is the only model they use, but it's one of them, is they will take a random sampling of playlists on Spotify, and they will, like actual playlists, like user-generated popular playlists, and they will like let's say it's 30 tracks in length. They'll take out one track, and then they'll train the machine learning algorithm where the only positive feedback is if it guesses the exact track that they removed. So they say, okay, try a million different things. Try to get the right track. And it can go through literally millions of guesses in a very short time frame because it's a computer.
Right.
And only once it starts guessing like let's say you train on one playlist until it guesses that track. And then take the settings that you use to derive that answer. Let's go to another playlist. Can you find the missing track in this one?
Wow.
And once they train this algo, to a point where it can just reliably guess the missing track in any playlist, then they take your user history and they tell it to guess the missing track.
That's insane though. Like,
yeah.
It's almost, because my understanding of this algorithm, like I understand algorithms, right? And I nerd out on some, machine learning stuff, and but I've never done it, right? Like I'm not a developer, so I'm always impressed with this stuff because it's the things that we go to college for, right? Like we have people who go and get their PhD in psychology, and they're like evaluating behavior, right? And evaluating things, and trying to identify like what caused such problem, right? So they're almost solving like social equations, and like you have to go to college for like years and years and years and years, and study tons of different people before you have kind of like an instinct or even the logic to figure this stuff out. And so
It's nuts.
yeah, it's crazy that it's such a cool world we live in, which is why like when Cirque says that soon creativity will be one of the only things automated, like this is a perfect, or the only thing that isn't automatable, right? Like this is one of those things that really illustrates exactly what that is.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, to a degree, like the Spotify recommendation engine is making decisions that we would typically foist onto the realm of creativity, quote unquote.
Right.
Like putting together a playlist that people are going to enjoy that follows a narrative in terms of energy is something that we would consider a creative task, like a DJ does it.
True. Well, I mean, that's crazy that the machine's probably doing it better than a curator. You know what I mean?
That's so crazy.
Yeah. So wait, I have a question. Does the algorithm do this based solely on user activity across its, hundreds of thousands or millions of users, however it is? Or does it like analyze beats or like what all is up in this?
So perfect question to get into it. So, okay, so when you go and visit Spotify, let's say you're on a desktop or mobile, you go to visit Spotify and your homepage populates. Now your homepage has its own recommendation engine behind it, which is based off of a lot of the math we're going to go into in a second. But let's say that you go to like an algorithmic playlist or just your homepage, like anywhere where the algorithm is invoked. And it's really a recommendation engine. I've been trying to train myself off of calling it an algorithm because it's actually like many algorithms.
Right.
But yeah, it's a recommendation engine. So let's say you visit your Discover Weekly, for instance. Your Discover Weekly is fed by what is called the recommendations pipeline, which is like a storage house for the mathematical calculations of the recommendation models. So recommendation models discover for this user ID, based on what we know right now, what are the right songs.
Whoa.
And it feeds those recommendations into a pipeline, which then gets distributed out to you. And most of these things are updated daily. Now, there's 3 recommendation models behind the pipeline. And the primary one is what they end up calling... there's many different ways to describe it, but I like to call it the latent vector space is what they call it. And it seemed like the easiest way to understand it. So, okay, basically every song ID, every user ID, every artist ID exists in a 2 or 3 dimensional, depending on how you calculate it, space, like a physical space. And proximity to each other equals likelihood of similarity. Right. So like if my user ID is close to this song ID in the latent vector space, then it is likely that I'll enjoy the song if I've never heard of it.
Right.
And so the way that they calculate that is they take they use matrix math, which is like really intense math. I can point you to a mini course from Khan Academy that I took to try to just like wrap my head around what was going on.
Oh my gosh.
And it's great. I'll walk you through it pretty well, but you'll definitely go cross-eyed like a few times. But ultimately, like a matrix in mathematics, a matrix is like a set of brackets. And in those brackets is rows and columns of numbers, right? Now, so you might think of it as like a grid of numbers.
Yeah, like the matrix drop-down screen, right? Yeah. Like those are all numbers and rows and columns.
So let's say on that screen there was like rows and like there was 5,000 rows and 3,000 columns or whatever, of numbers. Right. That would be a gigantic matrix. Now, Spotify's matrix that they start out with is every user ID and every song ID in Spotify, so user IDs are rows, so that's 217 million rows.
Oh my gosh.
And it's estimated somewhere north of 60 million columns, right? Now, so let's say I go to Corrin's user ID in the matrix, and then I go to one of her songs, right? In the columns.
Yeah.
At that intersection of her row and the song's column, there should be some data there to tell me she streamed this song, right?
Okay,
yes,
okay.
That's a positive.
Right.
But what I don't know, but I assume, I don't know this for sure, but I believe that they have a way of saying that you've listened to a song more than once. So it's not just zeros and ones. It's not just binary, but I don't know that for sure because they represent it as binary.
Right.
So, okay. So then they use a process, a calculation called matrix factorization. I have it on the screen right here. So they have different variables here. So it's 1 if a user is streamed to tracked, otherwise it's 0. And then, so they run this big calculation and it basically spits out 2 numbers. One is the vector, the latent factor vector for the user and the latent factor vector for a item, which is a song. Right. Basically meaning it spits out coordinates for where these things should go in latent vector space. It takes all the data about who has streamed all these tracks. What other tracks have those users streamed? And they run this complex matrix factorization to arrive at a set of coordinates for where songs and users should sit in latent vector space. They remake the vector space every day.
Oh my gosh.
And
okay. Wait a second. So
yeah.
I'm like, hold on, because Cirque is going to go down the rabbit hole here. So can you talk about this? Like, okay, I'm in a room, right? Like, can you explain this in some way in the common physical world? Like, I know we're taking something that's kind of like if anyone's ever used Music Map, right? Like that's the most simplistic version of this that we could be talking
it's
about.
Sort of like it, but not really.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, like, can you make this something in the tangible world? Is there a way that you can kind of illustrate? Yeah,
totally. Let's say that your row in the matrix and my row in the matrix are almost identical.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Except for one song that I've streamed and you haven't.
Okay.
That means that like the one song that I streamed and you haven't is so close to you in the latent vector space that it is like the primary candidate to get recommended to you in some way. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So depending on how similar users look in the tracks that they're listening to and what the algorithm has said that these various users have listened to, they're almost like grouping people together, like by the things that they've liked and comparing the rows or the columns of the things that they've listened to and figuring out like, okay, where's the whole, like they have all these ones that match and here's the ones that only this person has listened to and here's the one only this person has listened to. So now I'm going to basically like switch them over kind of, so that I'm suggesting these other songs.
Right.
Yeah, I got it.
If it were monofactorial, like if it was just like, okay, find me all the users who are almost identical, but except for one song.
Right.
And then let's recommend those songs to people. Like that might be a very simplified version of what the recommendation engine would do.
Very, very
but then you
simplified,
add in, right. Then you add in, find me all the songs that have been streamed by almost the exact same users except for one. And then recommend it down the chain. Okay, now you're adding in another factor. So the matrix factorization allows you to deal with like 3 or 4 different factors and arrive at an actual physical like space,
right?
Basically. And it's not, so like because they do in these developer conferences, they will pull up a graphic like version of the latent vector space, but they're doing it so you can understand better because that's not where they operate, right? Like they're not like flying through the latent vector space, sniping out, nearby neighbors to your user ID.
Yeah,
like
Star
that's not
Trek
how it works.
Galaxy
it's not
stuff.
like a video game.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Like this is just a visualization,
right?
But it's a great way to understand what's going on. They show you different renderings of the vector space. So I show you some renderings where like color represents genre groupings. So as it gets like closer to this hue, you're getting more into like the hip hop, and then the deepness, the actual lightness of the color represents streaming frequency. So you can look at a person's like I can look at your personal vector space and just look at song IDs and artist IDs and where they all fit.
Right.
And look at your streaming data and it can show me depth. So there's like lots of different things that they can do. They can even, there was one developer who was talking about, I can go to once we run this matrix factorization, I can go to it and say Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Yeah.
Plus like a song by Eric Clapton minus Nirvana's unplugged version of Smells Like Teen Spirit. What does that equal? And the algorithm will spit out the unplugged version of the Eric Clapton song.
That's crazy.
No bullshit.
Yeah.
So they can run simple math operations on it.
Well, especially considering like
So that's the main
those
way.
aren't artists that would be considered similar. And this is what I've always wondered this
No.
because like on Spotify, I don't listen to Discover Weekly very often. And I like the very particular things that I like because I listen to most genres of music. I sway more towards rock music, some of the like really, like Max Martin, Dr. Luke kind of stuff. And then like electronica, like Bass Nectar and Zed, less poppy Zed, like deep cut Zed. So like, I always wonder when I do go over to Discover Weekly, I'm always like, how is Spotify figuring out that super weird mix and mixing them up and discover, like, I'm not just getting rock music, and then they've got those like daily mixes, like 1 through 4. And like, as I've used, because I used to be solely an Apple Music kid, partially because they, pay artists better. And I have like all Apple everything, Apple Watch, iPhone, all of that stuff. So when I moved over to Spotify and started listening more, the more I listened, the better it got about things to recommend to me. But even in these various genres, and I think that's something that we don't think about as artists, is that like, if you're a rock musician and you have fans, it doesn't mean they're only rock musicians or rock fans. You know what I mean? Like, there's a lot of other things that they listen to. And so like, of course, Spotify would have to be able to figure out like, okay, here's this user and they listen to this purple stuff and this green stuff, even though those things are nowhere close to each other. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it's just, it's crazy.
100%.
It's crazy.
It's very nuts, and it gets so much crazier than just what we've gone over. Like, we don't have enough time in this podcast to go over all the stuff, which is why there's going to be a lot in the resources section.
I don't have the brain capacity to go into all this in this podcast episode.
It excites me so much. But you can go to entrepreneur.io/episode 103 to get all the show notes and just do your own deep dive.
Dude, this is going to be the podcast episode that has like 25 resources. Like, usually our podcast pages have like 2 or 3, and so it's going to be like, here's the top 3 dozen resources you should go check out.
For real. But yeah, so that's the first model, and that's the primary model. That's the model that they use, for instance, to train Discover Weekly. Like, the data set that the Discover Weekly recommendation engine trains on is this latent vector space, is what they call it. It's where all the song IDs and user IDs live based on the data that it has from the matrix. So the matrix is just like the streaming record of every user, every song. And it uses that to spit out this proximity, like this relationship based, categorization for every song and user ID.
Right.
And like, that's just so fucking nuts. Anyway, so you move on from there. That's the main model that feeds the recommendations pipeline. The second model, which, my jaw dropped when I first found it out. And obviously we here at Entrepreneur don't like to hear these things, but we, dogma is expensive. So we try not to be dogmatic. But ultimately, the second model of Spotify's recommendation engine is based almost entirely on articles on the internet, like blog PR, and playlists on Spotify, like playlist campaigns. So Spotify realized, okay, well, we don't have a lot of data to tag up all these songs and find out more about these songs and these artists. So we need to start using other data sets. We need to incorporate them into our data set. So they trained a model to read from relevant music outlets, places where music is described, which includes like music journalism, but it also includes music metadata out there on the internet, like for instance on Last.fm, which feeds Spotify in a big way. So there's just a lot of data out there that they could pull from to jumpstart or bootstrap their latent vector space. So every other model that Spotify has feeds back into the latent vector space in several ways. So basically what they do is they run natural language processing, which is the same technology that we use to to like develop automated artificial intelligence chatbots or to develop artificial intelligence driven like journalism or translation algorithms and things like that.
Right.
So natural language processing, NLP, and they basically break down the text. Whenever your song or your artist name is instantiated on the internet, somewhere that they're checking, they read the text and look at the proximity of words, other terms to your artist name. So a term like exciting or bluesy or Jack White, you know, like these are all terms that might be descriptive of your music. And it scours for relationships between your song name or your artist name and these terms.
Right.
And then it attaches that data set to your artist ID or to your song ID in the latent vector space and uses similarity between your song and other songs in terms of the NLP data to make more recommendations. So essentially you might think you're already existing somewhere in the latent vector space. You're already there. Your song ID is already there, but they don't know enough about it. So it's not, maybe they're a little bit fuzzy on where specifically it should be.
Yeah.
And this data strengthens that signal and allows them to nudge it closer to its best location in the vector space. So ultimately, if you're out there, if you get 10 blog articles in places where they're checking, where they talk about how you're like the Rolling Stones, your dot in the vector space moves closer to the Rolling Stones, as far as I understand.
Right. That's crazy. And okay, so the other thing too, we always have been like, oh, blogs are dead now. You know what I mean? And it's funny that now this like blog placement or, you know, mentions online or whatever have kind of shifted back into, you know, a level of importance for an entirely different reason than it used to be important. Right. And like, I think that's crazy. And I also think that it's just like whether, you know, okay. So let's say that you like hire some company, some PR company to get you placed on a bunch of blogs. And so like this machine is going to be able to figure out like, okay, what are the types of artists that are being published on this blog, right? It probably has the capacity to be like, okay, this is like a more legit blog. This is a blog that has like no relationship between these artists. Whereas, you know, this section of the Billboard blog is like the rock section. And like, you know what I mean? Like,
well, you also might imagine that like, okay, it's training to make recommendations. Those recommendations get positive and negative feedback, which tells it information about whether it was wrong or right.
Right.
So it might, any element of this might learn over time, and that's going to become important later. But yeah, like it. So it's dumb. It just reads the text, the web page as if it's a text document. But over time, it might start to ignore things like links out to other articles that have the artist's name because that's not relevant. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's almost like it's going to put more pressure. Like blog placement has now come back into a place where it could be relevant, but at the same time, it puts more pressure on like only getting your stuff fed to blogs that like you are of a little bit more, that are more relevant, more significant.
Not only that, but it's like metadata is equally as important, you know?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Like any text document that contains your artist name or your song matters. It could matter.
Yeah.
It's so weird.
Totally. That's so crazy, man.
It is nuts. So they built this model to scour the internet and steal metadata from other data sets. Great. Then they were like, well, we've actually got a shitload of text documents that have this data in it that we own, which is their 2.2 billion playlists, I believe is the number. So if they treat these playlists like text documents with just artists and song names and a description and a name, they can train their NLP models on that to find associations between artists and songs. So they also do that, but they only do it for playlists that they consider good, quote unquote. I've heard multiple developers say, we do this with good playlists.
So like ones that you pay to be placed on, like that people don't
engage with. Not necessarily though.
Well, no.
There are plenty that you don't.
Yeah. Oh, I totally get that. But the ones that you like pay to be placed on but don't actually make sense or don't have user engagement, like it's like parsing that out, you know?
It's not even helping you.
Right.
It's not because ultimately there's two things that go into you getting recommended, and it's how proximal are you to things that people actually will like your music also like in the latent vector space, and how popular is your music. Those two things alone. Because if you're like, let's say you're really close to the Rolling Stones, but Rolling Stones fans hate your music, that's a disaster for you.
Right.
Even if you're really popular, your shit will go down. So accuracy is what matters.
That's crazy. Because like, I know that as much as I don't pay attention to Spotify, like there were 2 instances where my songs ended up on Discover Weekly for a good period of time. And one of them was triggered when I played Warped Tour 16 and I got put on not even like the Warped Tour playlist, because Warped Tour, like, yeah, it's known for its alternative rock and even like screamo metal type stuff. But there's lots of artists on Warped Tour, especially on the Discovery stages, that are not, you know, typical rock artists. You know, Katy Perry did it back in 2008 or 7 or whatever it was. So like it's, you know, there were a lot of different artists on that, but there was a user playlist that like put together Warped Tour 16, but he only put on like the rock artists that he liked, and he put on even the small ones, you know. But you know, I actually contacted him and I was like, hey, thanks for putting me on your playlist, because I'm getting a ton of listeners from that. And he was like, yeah, well, I went through and listened to like the artists when they announced the lineup. I put on the ones that I liked so that I could learn like their best songs, so that when I showed up to their show, I would know some of the songs, you know, even if they weren't artists I knew, you know what I mean? And so he was like sharing that playlist, and people, when you search for Warped Tour 16, it actually pops up higher than the official Vans Warped Tour 16 lineup playlist. And I think it's probably because he kind of lumped these, you know, he just put rock artists on it, and it didn't have this mix. So there was one spike I had on Discover Weekly that was that, and then another was a playlist that Tyler Smith of Danger Kids had, and it was all, you know, very, very similar to my, you know, genre of music. Right. And that was another spike because he's got a big following just as a person. You know, Danger Kids plays in like Journey stores, you know, so like everyone that he put on there was kind of a fit for that, and that was another spike, and it stayed on Discover Weekly for like 5 months or something, and it slowly tailored off, you know. But there was a point where my monthly listeners was in the 80K range, and I was like, why is this happening? You know, because these are both small playlists that have like a few thousand followers, like nothing huge, right? But somehow that's just what it, you know, turned out to. So now I kind of understand like how that happened.
There's just so much that goes into it that it's hard to really pin down like one thing, and it's sort of, you have to develop like a sort of system-wide like blanket approach, because if you get specific with every method, there's a lot that you could optimize in the wrong way, and it's still settling. So, you know, who knows where it will be in 5 years, but like it's just crazy to know, like not only does like what playlists you end up in matter a lot in terms of being, if insofar as your goal is to get recommended a lot in Spotify, but also there's like it's entirely possible that this type of math is being factored into the search results of Spotify. So, you know, if your playlist shows up for a certain artist when it's searched, it could be the popularity of your playlist, plus the instance of that artist's name in your playlist, including the description.
It just means that your music needs to be good. You know what I mean? Yeah. Like I mean, it's not just about like sending people to your stuff. And I really dig that, actually, because I've always thought like, I don't like the hunting down curators thing, which I know it can work if done correctly. And I also don't like nagging people to like pre-save stuff or to, you know, whatever. And I mean, the fact that so many factors are going into this, like you should still make those efforts to promote your music, obviously. But the fact that there's so many other things integrated into it really means that all of these like beat the algorithm or game the algorithm kind of strategies are, just like in Facebook and in Instagram, like this
Right.
is not going to work. And I think it puts a lot of pressure on like ethical white hat stuff, which is what we want. That's the entrepreneur way.
That was sort of a big realization for me, is that like we have always said, like, don't be in listen pods and engagement pods, and don't spam people with your link to Spotify.
Right.
You could get all types of wrong people there, and don't get on sketchy playlists where you're going to run up, your listenership with people who aren't real or who listen to a bunch of weird shit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's all here. Like, insofar as you are using tactics that involve your song being streamed by people who not only don't actually like your song, but listen to a bunch of stuff that isn't your music, your type,
Mm-hmm.
the recommendation engine thinks that you're in the completely wrong space.
Right.
And everyone they recommend you to hates it. And
yeah.
And so they're constantly being told, hey, this artist shouldn't be recommended, and we actually don't know where they should be in the vector space. So they're like unrecommendable.
Right. And then they
search
for your like artistry online, and there's nothing, there's no like documentation, or there's no blogs, or there's no whatever. And it's like, oh yeah, well, this is just something that, we don't need to show anybody.
There's nothing we can do.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And that's a big problem. It's like, if we don't know where this is supposed to go, and every time we try to recommend it to get some more streaming data on it,
right,
it's a negative experience for the user.
Yeah.
There's nothing we can do.
Yeah.
Hands are tied.
It's crazy.
Another issue that they had, which is why they have a third recommendation model, is something they call the cold start problem, which is everything that we do is based on songs getting written about, songs getting included in playlists, and songs being streamed by our users.
Right.
If none of those three things have happened yet, we have what is called the cold start problem. There's no streaming data. Like a track's brand new, this classic cold start issue, right?
Right.
There's no streaming data. The track's brand new. This hasn't been written about. It's not in any playlist. There's no metadata out there on Last.fm or where have you, wherever they're checking.
Right.
And so for a while, Spotify simply could not recommend those songs safely. They just couldn't do it. They could maybe use info about your artist ID to make a guess as to what type of music this was. But so anyways, a summer intern that was at Spotify built a audio analysis engine. And that audio analysis engine basically takes a look at the spectrogram of the song, which is like the audio data laid out visually.
Right.
And it then analyzes that spectrogram using a certain machine learning model where it takes a look at each like sections of the spectrogram piece by piece, and then runs its own like crazy calculation on all that data to figure out, in a very backwards, like non-intuitive way, what is the key of this song? What's the tempo? How many beats? What's the pitch, the timbre, the chord progression, the melody? Maybe we can make some guesses as to the genre, the aggressiveness, the loudness. They can find all that out based on this audio profile.
Right.
And then they use that as data fed into the latent vector space. It's every song in Spotify has this data, has something attached to the song ID that basically places this song better in latent vector space.
I love how that was an intern who did that.
Yeah, that was my favorite part. Yeah, we had an intern build this thing, and we used it.
And now it's implemented in all of our systems.
Yeah.
I want an intern like that.
Yeah, the machine learning developer world is nuts, but I'm sure it was a well-paid intern.
Of course, yeah.
Or I hope. Yeah. But yeah, so the only way that this actually happens, though, so it can happen for tracks that you just release, but your song's not going to get on release radar in the first week because they don't know who to recommend it to. Mm-hmm. But after a little while, it will. But for a while now, they've been allowing you to quote unquote submit a song for editorial playlist consideration.
Right.
But what I didn't know going into this is that also it allows them the 7 days that they need. If you do it 7 days early, it gives them the time they need to analyze your song's spectrogram and then place it in the latest version of the model of the engine.
Ah.
And then they automatically include you in Release Radar in the first week based off of the audio data of your song. That's the only thing they're using to make those first week recommendations in Release Radar.
Oh. That's funny because when I came out with Charlatan, I like put it in, obviously submitted it, and it was like, what genre? And I'm like, well, it's a rock song that features a rapper, And then I started thinking, like, what did they think that like Linkin Park should be, or what if they, Danger Kids is the same kind of sound, like they have rock mixed with like rap and stuff. And I'm like, so what do you do when it doesn't fall? And I'm sure like lots of indies are like, I'm not any of these genres, right? Because everybody does. I'm not like everybody else. But so it's interesting now, and it's good to know that there's more evaluation going on than like somebody behind, because I was like, how in the world could they possibly like listen through all these tracks and like identify all these things about? I was like, there's no way. There's thousands of or millions or whatever it is of all these tracks like being submitted every single day. How in the world are they even managing that? And so I really disregarded that process as something that was like, nah, like that's not going to do anything, and like the fact that they've got a machine learning and evaluating, I mean, it's at least something, right? Like there's probably gonna be a lot of artists who are like, well, I don't.
It's huge. We just did it for Dukes, and he got 1,000 first week Release Radar listeners.
Nice.
It's crazy.
Nice. Yeah. See, that's the kind of stuff that a lot of artists are probably like, man, I don't want a machine listening to my stuff or whatever. A machine's not going to be able to evaluate my stuff properly, but it's like at least something's happening, right? And it's not like, oh, you're not on a label, so screw you. Like there's some intent behind that whole process. And that's
totally.
A relief.
They only build it. Right. They only built it to benefit people who would never be able to start up their streaming data otherwise.
Right.
So it's purely for artists starting out, if you think about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's crazy. That's great. I love that.
Yeah. And so that's not the only place that they make it fair. So that in the recommendations they make for your homepage, they include randomness. They might randomly recommend you an album from an artist who's not so popular. Or just random. Like there's the most recent one was a Spotify developer named Oscar Stahl, I believe. I'll link to it in the show notes, but he talks about how when they were building the most recent iteration of the homepage recommendation, which was previously the Discover tab, and now it's like right there on your homepage, is every slot that's in those rows on your homepage has a chance of being just a random slot.
Right.
To allow for fairness. And then also they've started to do this thing that Oscar talks about where they optimize for two different variables. So instead of like, you might optimize your Facebook campaign to get a lowest cost per click or lowest cost per video viewer.
Right.
They're optimizing their recommendation engine to maximize user satisfaction and like equity, like fairness to less popular artists at the same time. So it's very difficult mathematically to optimize for two factors.
Yeah.
But they're doing it.
That's nuts. It's funny too, because I always like, there's certain things, this is very separate from the business operations of Spotify, and a lot of
way separate.
Yeah, like the way that, and I've heard that too from people who work at Spotify, is like, okay, like all these segments of, the genius of Spotify and the marketing of Spotify is very, very different, and like, Spotify, their royalty payouts and their complaints about being on the App Store and all of these things where Spotify and Apple are fighting, it's always like this PR or this, negative press about Spotify, and which is why I've always just been like, meh. Like I'm down on Spotify.
Yeah.
But, when they say like, oh yeah, well, we try to, promote, like this is a better opportunity for indie artists than anywhere else. I've always been like, that's baloney, because like, there's a million reasons why I didn't believe them. But when you actually go over to the developer side, you're like, okay, so maybe the business side of Spotify is like pushing label and pop artists more or whatever, because these labels own a big portion of Spotify. But at the same time, like there are certain pieces in the algorithm that like have to look at these things and can't just like ignore. I mean, I guess it's possible that like bigger artists are given like more weight somehow in this algorithm, but I think that would be another variable that would be really difficult to work into all of the things they're already considering from what you've explained. So I just like, now I'm like, well, maybe I need to learn more about this, change my position a little.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, like it's a miracle what they've done, but it's not good enough. Like,
Right.
Like it's not the final solution to the problem of paying artists appropriately for their artwork.
Right.
Streaming.
Right.
Like
that's a whole
current
other
iteration
thing.
of streaming is not it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's encouraging that they have such talented people who are like earnestly thinking about these challenges.
Yeah.
It's so cool that they take so much time to build in equity for unsigned and undiscovered artists.
Right.
Like they spend a lot of time on it. They build their products around it.
Yeah.
And so that's all encouraging. Aside, like we know a lot of shady shit about the business of Spotify.
Right.
Including their move to podcasts and like the real reason for it.
Yeah.
But, like the developer side is actually really cool.
Yeah.
And what they've done is massive. So like ultimately the overarching strategy for like any indie on Spotify is generate streaming data, which is like you need to generate listeners and streams and followers who are the right people, right? That's most important. Like they have to be people who actually through no like coercion love your music.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's so important. Otherwise, you're never going to get recommended to the right people. And we haven't even talked about this. So let's just talk about this. Is like Spotify's. We talked about exactly how Spotify gets to the point where they're ready to recommend to you. But what happens then?
Right.
Like that's what this really matters is like if you're in Discover Weekly for a batch of 100 users and you don't get unambiguous positive signals from them. Like liking a track is an unambiguous positive signal. Like if it happens, it's clearly positive.
Right.
Skipping a track is an ambiguous negative signal. So they don't know if someone skips your track that it's bad. But adding a track to your playlist, like that's an unambiguous positive signal. So if they don't get those kinds of signals from the first batch of users, you're going to die on Discover Weekly.
That's so funny because when I listen to Discover Weekly and I hear a song that I don't like, I skip it thinking, and I like rush to skip it before it hits 30 seconds. Not because I don't want that artist to get paid, but because I always just assumed because that's the marker they use for payment, that was a significant place where I need to skip it before then so that like they don't recommend things like that to me anymore. And now I realize that that might not be a thing. The other thing is I never like tracks. Like I have a playlist that if you want to see how stupid and weird my tastes are, I have a playlist called Stuff I Like Lately. And there's some old stuff on there that I've liked for a long time. And I like every kind of thing is on. I've got Katy Perry and Ariana Grande on there, but I've also got like Asking Alexandria and, Zed and Bass Nectar and whatever, right? Like that's the stuff I listen to. And I don't generally listen to mix stuff. But every once in a while I'm like, okay, this playlist is, done. And so I'll listen to Discover Weekly for the day and I won't like songs, but I'll drag them over to the Stuff I Like Lately podcast, which I listen to on repeat. I have that one. And then I have a playlist called Music for Badass Tech and Coding, which is mostly just like electronic and drum and bass stuff that doesn't have a lot of words in it so that I can focus on the thing that I'm doing. So I don't have words and I'm not like, analyzing a song for a hook or something. And those are the two playlists that I have, but that's usually what I indicate to Spotify that I like something. So instead of the like button. So is that in an unambiguous category as well?
If your behavior is, so from what I can tell, especially from Oscar's presentation, is that Spotify is looking at different types of listeners and it's categorizing you. So if your behavior is consistent, then you're contributing accurate positive and negative signals. So Spotify might learn about your user ID
right.
that you are someone who automatically will skip anything they don't like 100%,
Oh, okay.
then you're good. But if you put on songs if you listen to a lot of playlists that have like a lot of just like leave it on and you're not near the device and you don't skip those,
Yeah.
then Spotify can't necessarily say for sure that you not skipping a song is a positive signal.
Right.
That makes sense?
Yeah, totally makes sense.
So it trains on your behavior.
Yeah. I listen to the new alt. That's another one that I really like. If you like alternative rock or even alternative pop, that's a good one. But and it doesn't pop up. I'll listen to it and I'll drag stuff over to my playlist from there. And lately, it's like shown me stuff that I really do like, whereas before my Discover Weekly was off, you know? So yeah, I guess like, so you're saying that like taking any action of a deliberate kind, aside from skipping, it's like it could communicate something, whereas passive listening is not as much of an indicator, which means if you're on a playlist that's ambient, it's not necessarily that it's bad, but it's also not necessarily giving Spotify a lot of signals if it's just like a playlist where no one's really taking any kind of action.
Right. Well, yeah. So there's a lot of different ways that Spotify can calculate positive and negative feedback, but it's not a stupid system, right? Like it doesn't just blanket.
It's not just like pre-saves, which is what they're always telling everybody to worry about the most.
Get those pre-saves. Yeah. Another thing is like, think about it like this, right? When you pre-save, as far as I understand, the technology works like the technology you're using to get pre-saves saves the user ID and the permission to add the track when it's released to their playlist and like it from them.
Right.
So it's not actually doing it when they quote unquote pre-save. It does it at literally the moment it comes out, right?
Yeah.
So what you have is a flood of, okay, so let's think about it like this. The best quality data you could have for Spotify to train on is data of streams from the exact people who actually love your music and no one else. Specifically, they love the song that they streamed.
Right.
That's the best quality data you can get.
Yeah.
And it gets more fuzzy out from there. One particularly fuzzy set of data is a bunch of saves from people who've never even listened to the song yet.
Yeah. And especially
like,
if they
how
don't
does a machine learning model...
Yeah. If they don't listen to it later that week after it's been saved, like then there's really like why would that be valuable?
Like I love Real Big Fish, right?
Yeah.
But there's tons of their catalog that I don't like. Yeah. And if you recommend me a bunch of songs that are like those songs, I won't like it.
Right.
But if Real Big Fish sticks their ad in front of me and says, hey, pre-save this track, it'd help us out a lot, I would do it.
Yeah.
But that's not giving good data. So anyways,
Gotcha.
They don't specifically say that they root out pre-saves from the machine learning model.
Right.
And the business side of Spotify is always saying to get your pre-saves.
Right.
But as far as I understand it, this machine learning model is constantly learning, and it's not so obvious how it's learning. So it might just start to root out things without being told to by developers because it's a neural network. Yeah. It might, if it's good enough, it should root out pre-saves because it's fuzzy data. It will eventually root them out or weight them differently.
Yeah.
And so a save without a listen is not necessarily a great thing, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and it's possible too, like we're saying that the development section of Spotify is so different from the business section. It's possible that the business section isn't totally listening to developers, or that, you know, if they are like, hey, you send people to pre-save their stuff, like in a lot of cases, that's sending people to Spotify, right? So their monthly activity, you know, their active users goes up, even if that person isn't necessarily, if they're more like I used to be, where they're more of an Apple Music user than Spotify, but they love the artist, so they're going to try to help them out to pre-save. So it could be the business side, like trying to get their monthly active users up, try to get people back into the infrastructure so that they can sell them on a paid membership. You know what I mean? Like there's so many business things that could be motivating that have nothing to do with the algorithm. And I'm not saying that's how it is, but I could see how that could be true, that like pushing pre-saves from the business side or the marketing side or the PR side of Spotify may or may not be connected to that actually being valuable in the algorithm.
Yeah. I mean, I when you start down that line of thinking we just started down, it's easy to see how saves might not be so tight.
Right.
Because they're like, because there's something that artists seek to game, they may not be so unambiguous.
Or even if they are like unambiguous, maybe they have a much lower weight, when it's considering all these variables. It might be something that just doesn't weigh as heavy as other actions.
Yeah. What's clear to me is that the only way for something to really take off from a recommendation standpoint is like, one, you have a hit, like a classic music industry hit, right?
Yeah.
And everyone's listening to it. That's great. Sure, it's going to take off because it's just going to have such a high popularity ranking out the gate. It's going to be related to songs that are just popular, not necessarily by genre, but just because of their obscene popularity. So that's one way. But the second way is to at the moment that you become eligible for wide distribution on Discover Weekly and Release Radar, the data that feeds those recommendation models is so fucking accurate that literally everyone it recommends to is like, fuck yeah, dude. And it streams it like 30 times immediately. And that will immediately tell Spotify, like, you found the money, give this the widest distribution. And so like, to me, it's like we should be pre-qualifying people instead of trying to get people to go to Spotify. You should be stopping people from going to Spotify unless they really like what they're about to get sent to.
Yeah. That's that's crazy because like we talk about that in other things in marketing, right? Like excluding the wrong people, having the right message for the right people. And like, no offense to anybody, but like I exclude entrepreneur engagement from my music promotion, not because I hate you guys, but because like I don't want to have
fuzzy data.
Yeah, exactly. It's fuzzy, even though some of you might like my music. Hopefully all of you, but but like it's funny that is completely supporting the same thing that we say about so many other elements of marketing, is like get the right people or else like this action or this activity is now not worth, all the effort you put into it.
Yeah. And that's so I just described this like really advantageous way that you could end up on Discover Weekly where like all your data is right. Like it's exactly right. Every person who's ever streamed your track absolutely loves it. They weren't doing you any favors.
Right.
Okay. Now think about it like this. The pool that you're in matters. So if all that's true, but you're doing, let's say like the intersection of Celtic folk music and ska, right? You have a pretty niche down audience.
Right.
We were at CD Baby recently, and I believe there was at one talk someone said like, "Can you niche down too much?"
Yeah.
Yes, you 100% can niche down too much. Yes, and so you don't want to be in the smallest pool when you want, for instance, like, let's say that only half of a given subgenre is going to ever like your music like a lot, enough so that like when they're recommended it, they love it.
Right.
Would you rather that subgenre have 100,000 people or 2,000 people? Because you want to be playing you want to be swimming in a pool that's relatively large enough, not so large that there's a high chance that people won't like the specific song, but large enough that there will be a lot of right people in it. And if you're niching down and excluding like elements of your artistry to like fit a smaller niche, like don't do that.
Yeah. Well, like, okay, so take that example, right? Like Celtic music, but it like with a ska edge, right? Like so people who like Celtic music would not necessarily like your stuff. In fact, most of them probably wouldn't. And then some ska people would like your stuff, but a lot of them wouldn't.
Not all.
Right. And so it's funny because that's what we talk about with ads too. Is like you want a broader audience so that you're giving Facebook more data to find the right people. If you make it too small, then Facebook has to, it's limited to only the people that you're allowing them to survey or analyze. And in Spotify, it's the same thing. Like if you have more people, it's getting more meaningful data because it's enabled to find the right people. That's great.
Yeah. like you can be the world's foremost expert on putting on your clothes quickly. That's pretty niche. Or you can be the world's foremost expert on putting on your underwear quickly. That's too niche. You know?
Nobody wants that. Nobody wants it.
Yeah. That's not enough things. You can't build a career off that.
Right. You wouldn't want to put on your underwear really quickly to get out the door unless you've got some big personal life problems. But for the most part, you'd want to put on all your clothes first.
Yeah. I mean, if your maximum possible safe distribution for Discover Weekly is like 2,000 people, that, it's a definite ceiling. And once it hits that ceiling, Spotify doesn't know necessarily where to put you.
Right.
So don't be like, acid jazz, hip hop, funk. Like,
right.
It's okay to be acid jazz.
I mean, do and let me listen to it, but beyond that, because I want to know what that sounds like.
All I mean is don't niche down any further than is your artistic soul. If your artistic soul is that niche down, dude, that's your circumstance. You have to deal with it. That's your truth.
Right.
But don't niche down for because some marketer told you to do it more. Don't do that.
Agree. Totally.
And there's a very clear recommendation engine-based reason why you shouldn't. But yeah, so ultimately it's feed Spotify clean data. Right now, for the last 4 months or 5 months, I've been running consistent traffic on a single song that's not on Spotify yet.
Right.
It's releasing this Monday. I submitted it for the release radar audio analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I used my fan finder data. So I looked at my fan finders that's been running and said, what's the best audience? The artists that their fans all love this song.
Right.
And then I went into Spotify's developer API, which you can go to developers.spotify.com and you can use it like it's a toy. And I just looked up those artists and found out what Spotify thinks their genre is. And then when I submitted my song to Spotify for playlist inclusion, I used those genres.
Nice.
And then, and now I've got over 1,000 or 2,000 people who all have been asking for the Spotify song.
Wow.
They've seen the video. They love the video. They want to hear the song.
Yeah.
The only marketing I'm going to do is talking to those people because I know they already love the song.
Right.
They're going to go into Spotify and stream it a bunch, and they're the exact right people for it. Facebook already did all that pre-selection for me. So I'm not going to run ads to a cold audience to go to this song.
Right.
Because I'm really trying to feed the right data in. And I think that's the best approach here is feed the right data in. And once you get to a certain size, you can start worrying about things like playlist placement, blog PR, but start with your own audience that you're building and then spin it out to, I would go with playlist placement first, just because it's it's going to have more of a return, quote unquote, than blog PR at first.
Right.
And build up and expect this is a 2 to 3 year investment that you make before I see people get successful with it.
Right.
So definitely be in it for the long haul. I know that I'm not going to probably make back the money that I've spent getting people to this single I'm about to release.
Right.
I mean, I might, but probably not. But that's okay. I'm just trying to build up my audience right now and feed the right data to Spotify so that when I hit an inflection point, I'm not being recommended to tons of Filipino people who just listen to whatever they're paid to listen to. Does that make sense? Filipino click farm workers who are just paid to listen to a whole smattering of unsigned artists.
Right.
Because that's who's buying these fake streams or who's advertising to these playlists. So you want it to be all the right people so that when it gets recommended, it's going to be to people who show Spotify they love it.
Right. And so that's why you're saying this is a long tail thing, especially if you're spending any money advertising. And especially if you're doing it to a cold audience, it's going to be really difficult to screen out, the right type of unambiguous action, the people who will take these unambiguous actions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And what matters more, what matters more is that if you have a strategy that will get you 1,000 right listeners or 10,000 fuzzy listeners in terms of data, go with the 1,000 right listeners.
Right.
Build a sturdy structure because when it pops off, it will fucking explode. I'm watching someone who's done some very good marketing for their Spotify right now. I'm looking at their growth curve from the since 2015 data. And it's a straight line up now.
Right. Yeah, totally. Yeah. That's crazy.
So, yeah. that's the Spotify recommendation engine. I hope that made sense to everyone.
I think we drilled it down to like, because I'm not, I'm not that into this either, So I'm not like you, who's like mapping out a matrix on my whiteboard. You know what I mean? Or whatever it is you're doing with it. So yeah, I think we drilled it down to some layman, some smart musician terms.
Yeah, and now if someone tells you this or that about the recommendation engine, you can be like, actually, it's this.
Actually,
Yeah, actually, this is how it works. So yeah, I hope that was helpful for everyone, and I hope it informs your long-term strategy as to promoting your growth on Spotify. And yeah, next week we'll be in here to talk about ads, direct to Spotify ads, and how you might use them. And hopefully this has been a good primer for that. Hopefully we're in a good place to do that.
Yeah.
Rock and roll. Well, yeah, if you guys want to check out this Spotify training, it will be available in about 3 weeks standalone, but you can also just go to indiepreneur.io/episode 103, and I'll leave a link to a trial for Indie Pro. If you're not an Indie Pro member yet, you can take it now for $1. And we'll see you guys next week on Creative Juice. Peace out. East Coast, West Coast, say what?